You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thorne,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Ashley Dyer.
He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have two wonderful authors on the show with me today, Margaret Murphy and Helen Pepper. Margaret and Helen write as the writing duo Ashley Dyer, and they have a fantastic new book that is out today, and it's called Splinter in the Blood by Ashley Dyer, and I was just telling them right before we started recording that they have cost me precious hours of sleep, and I thank them for that. So welcome to the show, Margaret and Helen.
Thank you very much, Hank.
We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller? And we'll start with you, Margaret.
Well, I wrote my first detective story when I was 10 years old, and it was 4 whole pages long. It was written in my school exercise book, and it was inspired by the noir films and the bits of detective novels I managed to kind of sneak from my parents' bookshelves because I wasn't allowed to read them, really. I got awarded a gold star for that story, and after that, my writing career was more or less inevitable. But it was 26 years before I was finally published as an author, and it really took a sort of kickstart. You know, a lot of people will say to me, oh, I'd love to write if I had the time. And I was one of those people because I had a full-time teaching career. But I have lupus. And when I was in my, mid-20s to early 30s, I had a series of TIA, sort of mini strokes. And one consultant said to me that there was a possibility if they didn't get it under control, that I would have a major stroke. And I realized that if I wanted to be an author, I better get started sooner rather than later. And now, thankfully, the lupus is under control, and it's given me 21 years, actually, of writing. So I'm quite grateful for that in a sense.
Absolutely. I love hearing those stories of that first initial awakening, if you will, where the writing gene fires up and a child knows that they are a storyteller. I think it's something that you're born with, and whether you go on to write epic novels or not, I think you're born a storyteller, and you and so many other people have that story of it kind of lying dormant for a while, but it always bubbles back up to the surface because the writer and the storyteller has to come out.
I think that's so true, Hank. I think it's something that we, in a sense, I thought as a child growing up, in a working class Liverpool-based family in the sort of northwest of England, that writing wasn't a thing that ordinary people like me did. And I think it was actually reading Stephen King that convinced me that you could write about ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. And that, in a way, gave me some confidence to just give it a go, really.
Right. I had a similar experience with Stephen King. When I was growing up as a kid, I never thought I liked those types of books. But one day when I actually got into it and gave it a chance, I realized that's his genius, is taking ordinary, everyday people like you and me, and then doing horrible things to them, or putting them in supernatural, crazy experiences and seeing how they react. And yes, I can definitely see that thread in what you've done.
Yeah, and he doesn't hold back, does he? He does really, really horrible things to very nice people in his novels.
Well, and sometimes to very nice people, sometimes to very horrible people, sometimes to kind of morally ambiguous people. That's the beauty of it, is they're sometimes we're great people, sometimes we're not, and you just never know which day you're going to catch us on.
Yeah.
Oh, Helen, what about you? What is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I don't really consider myself to be a storyteller, and definitely not a writer. I'm much more sort of theoretical and on the forensic side of things. I've always been a huge reader. I love reading, and always very, very much into crime stories, and a lot of true crime stories. And I think my interest in that was sparked when I was growing up. From about the age of 10, the area where I lived in Yorkshire, in the north of England, there was a serial killer on the loose, and known as the Yorkshire Ripper. And he basically curtailed all my teenage years because everyone had to stay in and not put themselves at risk. And there were police checks everywhere, and there was such a big effort to catch this guy. And it just really, really sparked my interest in crime. And I think that's where that's come from. But I am very much more of a reader than a writer. I have tried dabbling a little bit, but I'm not particularly good at it.
Well, we all have a role to play, and creativity shows up in different ways with different people. And I think I would venture that there's more there than you're giving yourself credit for.
Well, no, I see myself more as a fan and a little bit in awe of the people who actually have the talent to do, to tell the stories well.
I can't convince Hank. I can't convince Helen that actually forensic experts like herself are the kind of rock stars of the crime writing world. So that's how we see them.
Exactly. Helen, what do you think it is about these types of stories, made up or real? Because you talked about this event that captured your imagination and really brought out your love for these types of situations and how we unravel those, because that's a very human storytelling element. I think. What do you think it is about that really sets our minds on fire when we see these situations?
I think it's very much about being afraid but feeling safe. I think we sort of need the adrenaline rush of being scared But we want to know that we're not really in danger. I mean, I talked about growing up in an area where a serial killer was active. When you're a teenager, you're immortal, aren't you? So,
Right.
it was never going to be a problem for me. It was just, well, apart from, sort of scuppering my social plans. But it was just interesting. And I think people who read crime fiction, it's a bit like going on a roller coaster, isn't it? You get to feel really scared, but feel safe at the same time. I think it's the same sort of experience.
Yeah, I agree with you there for sure. Margaret, as someone who tells these kinds of twisted, horrible stories, what is it? Do you agree with Helen that it's the ability to have the rush of adrenaline and the fear and to feel that, but in the comfort and safety of your own home?
I think that's a very strong element for a lot of people, and it is for me too, because I do like to be thrilled and still feel that I can close the book if it's getting too much. But I also think that we read this kind of fiction to understand. And I think I started writing crime fiction because I did want to understand motivations. I wanted to understand the psychology, and I almost wanted to put myself in that situation to see how would I respond, and what is it that motivates the killer? Because one of the things that fascinates me is the reasons why people kill. And I suppose we know statistically that a lot of crimes are easily solved because it's usually someone who is known to the victim, and quite often it's a row that's gotten out of hand and people end up being killed. But when you have stranger killings, like the one that Helen mentioned earlier, where you have serial killers, and we know there are lots of serial killers on the loose, then those become far more complex for us, because it's very hard to understand why anyone would have that kind of psychology. Why would they want to harm people and to treat people in the way that they do, as commodities, as something that they can use and then discard? I think Ted Bundy actually referred to some of his victims as throwaways, because he'd use them and then that was it. He was finished with them. He would dump them, and he referred to them as throwaways. And that kind of psychology is almost impossible for ordinary people to understand, but we still want to get some understanding of it, I think.
Right. Helen, as a crime scene investigator, you examined more than 10,000 crime scenes, and what Margaret was just talking about, the serial killer, when you bring that into the mix, as an investigator, are all bets off at that point? Do you have to approach things completely different when you don't see the normal patterns? And when we're talking about murder, there should be no normal patterns. But I think you know what I mean. As an investigator, do you approach your work in a scientific way? And when you encounter something like that, how do you begin to decipher what's going on?
Well, the thing is, when you're a crime scene investigator, the most important thing is to find and recover anything that could be useful evidence. And quite often, when you're examining the crime scene, you don't have an awful lot of briefing. So you don't have too much of an idea of what's actually happened, and you've got to approach it very much with an open mind, so you don't assume anything. Quite often I've been to crime scenes where going in it's been fairly obvious that X has happened, and by the time we've finished, we'll actually know it was Y. So you can't assume that you know what's going on. You've got to cover all the bases, and you've got to take a very, very methodical approach to make sure that you don't miss anything. So the approach is very much the same, whether what you're examining is, I don't know, a theft of a stereo out of a car or a multiple murder. Obviously, the budget and the scale is somewhat different, but the approach that you use and the thought processes are exactly the same.
What happens when you when you find something that just nothing makes sense? I would imagine that a lot of murders you can pretty quickly tie it back to this is a crime of passion. This was a robbery gone wrong. What does it feel like as an investigator when you get to the scene and there's just no explanation? Someone just did this because they're just heinous human beings.
It can be confusing, but the whys of what's happened aren't always that important when you're processing the crime scene. Usually, I think it's more for the investigator to work out why things happened. The CSI just tries to establish what's happened and does that by recovering whatever evidence is there. Yes, you do allow yourself the luxury of thinking what on earth has happened here, but quite often it can be a bit of a committee decision as well. Everybody throws their ideas into the pot and then we investigate and try and find out exactly what's happened. But for a CSI, it's more about the what than the why. Although for Margaret as a writer, it's always an awful lot more about the why than the what.
Right. And, I think a lot of people, me included, are fascinated by the whole CSI experience, and television feeds that a lot, but I would imagine it brings a lot of misconceptions because things on television are wrapped up nicely and neatly in 42 minutes or less, and that is not the typical life of a CSI investigator, is it?
Oh, I wish. Yeah, not at all. And quite often a lot of them are never wrapped up at all. Right. But TV does really have a big influence in that everyone thinks that they're an expert. Right. And you have people following you around at the crime scene saying, "Are you sure you're doing that right? That's not how Grisham does it," or whatever. So, yes, it can be a little challenging.
And a novel is I think a better forum for that, because you do get to bring the characters out, slow the pace down from a television. Not that crime novels are slow, but compared to a 42-minute television show, you get to really build the characters and build the situation and bring that out. How did the two of you meet? Since Helen, you're an investigator and more of a scientist, and Margaret, you are a writer. How did the two of you come together, and what was the idea that brought you together?
Well, I had known of Helen, and I'd actually met her and spoken to her on the crime circuit at various conferences in the UK, and knew that she was working quite closely with a friend of ours, Anne Cleves, on the Vera and Shetland series already. And I knew that I wanted to write something that had a real core of that kind of CSI forensics element and policing element. And although, I do quite a lot of research and background, it's really not the same as being able to talk to someone who is, has done the job, has been to crime scenes, has seen dead bodies, has dealt with people in these really quite harrowing situations. So for me, it was a case of I need to speak to someone directly. And I wanted to have a close collaboration. I don't know, I think probably it was because I do have a background in science myself. I was a biology teacher for 17 years. And I did want that element of collaboration. I enjoy collaboration. And I'd worked on, they weren't ever accepted, but on TV scripts and that sort of thing in the past, and enjoyed that experience. So I approached Helen and wasn't sure whether she would say, "Oh, yeah, she would do it." So I don't know, what was your experience of getting that first communication, Helen?
Well, I was intrigued and I was definitely quite excited by it. It sounded fun. I'd been working with writers for probably about 15 years at this point, but it was always very much a writer has a specific query, they want to know what if, and they'd email me or ring me or whatever, and I'd answer the question, and that would be the end of it. And I really thought it would be fun to be a lot more involved in the whole process of the book, and to sort of be an author by proxy and try and pretend that I knew what I was doing. I just thought it would be fun.
And has it been?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
that was
lots of fun.
I was pitching there, Hank.
Yeah, Helen, I just you make me laugh because I've read this book and I don't buy what you're selling. I'm sorry. I think you you guys as a team are fantastic, and I still think you're selling yourself short. But that's an argument for another day. So you guys decided to work together. Did for Splinter in the Blood, the new book, was this Margaret, did you already have a kernel of an idea, or did you guys brainstorm this together from the ground up?
Well, I think kernel of an idea is a really good description of what I actually had. I had written down literally a one-page blurby outline to the story, and actually it wasn't the entire story, it was just the beginning of the story, really, in 2014. But I didn't start writing it until Helen and I started to collaborate on it in 2016, wasn't it, Helen?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so what I had in 2014, I went back and looked for this because someone asked me to do a sort of story behind the story before you invited us to do this. And I had written just one sentence initially. She looks down at him and feels anger and contempt, but also regret. So this woman is standing over the body of a man who's been shot, and that's what she thinks. Now, if you have anger and contempt, but also regret, then clearly you have some kind of relationship with that person, even if you can't stand them. But I didn't know who the woman was, who the man was, what was going on. I felt like I'd come in really in the middle of the story. And I started to think through, and I did have this idea that actually this was a serial killer novel, that there were 5 killings that had already happened. And somehow this shooting was almost a culmination of what had been going on for the previous year. And it wasn't really until Helen and I started to talk through ideas and just bat ideas backwards and forwards that, the more detailed, the more complex aspects of the story started to come out.
I want to take a pause from the show for just a moment to tell you about a sponsor. As a writer, your editor is often the first and last eyes on your work. The best editors are trusted collaborators, bringing your story to life in a way you didn't know was possible. Marlowe Moss will take your writing to a new level and your career to new heights, ensuring that readers not only buy your book, but also love reading it too. One top editor calls Marlowe Moss a talented author in his own right and as skilled an editor as I've seen. I use his skills myself. One of his authors says, "I had no idea my writing could be this good. Tension, POV, or timeline issues, plot and pacing, Marlowe does it all, and for the price of a copy edit." Your hard work deserves a better editor, and Marlowe Moss is the editing partner you've been looking for at a price you can afford. Offering developmental and copy editing as well as beta and proofreaders, visit marlowemoss.net for more information and a free sample edit. That's MarloweMoss.net. And let me tell you, I have used Marlowe Moss. He has edited a story for me, and the comments that I got back were eye-opening. As a writer and as someone who spends time with words as much as I do, you tend to gloss over things. You just completely lose them because you're so involved in creating, and you need to step away and let someone else put their eyes on it and help you see the things that you can't see for yourself. Marlowe Moss is amazing. MarloweMoss.net. Gotcha. Helen, what was, let me ask you this. When did you, Helen, did Margaret bring this scenario to you? And what was your first reaction when she started telling you about the ideas that she had?
Very first reaction, oh my goodness, how can those thoughts come out of that head?
I have that reaction all the time. You know, I talk to people that write crime fiction or horror, and they're always the nicest people. And I'm always thinking, how could you do this? You sound like such a normal person.
Well, yes, it is exactly that, and a little bit scary sometimes. But yes, I very much liked the ideas, and then it was more about, you know, sort of thinking, well, if I was trying to deal with that, what would I be doing? What would the scenes be like? What a sort of little twist that we can put in there. Maybe, you know, the evidence pushes you one way, but actually it's something completely different, you know. So it was about trying to think up interesting forensic things that could go in there. Because, I mean, to be honest, everyone has a degree in DNA profiling now, don't they? You know, we don't need to go there anymore. It's a bit old. And sometimes things that are really simple can work really, really well. So I think it's more about trying to think of things that haven't already been done to death on TV programs and things.
I think that's right. And I think sometimes it's also about subverting the norm, so that people expect, oh yeah, I know what this is going to happen, and then that, and then you completely turn it on its head, and that gets to be fun, and people start to really, I think, engage with that, because it is out of the ordinary.
Well, you're absolutely right. That's one of the best parts, is working on those twists and figuring out how you can pull the rug out from under the reader, because like Helen said, everyone is an expert now and has advanced degrees in television criminology. So, you know, we as writers have to keep looking for ways to keep them guessing and to do something new and fresh.
Yeah, I think that's right. I like that television criminology. I think I'm going to use that. Can I steal it from you?
That's free. You can have it. That's yours to have. That's a bonus prize for being on the show. So what was the writing process? Well, before we get into what the writing process was like, you said at first that you had these characters, but you didn't know who they were. Well, they turned out to be Greg Carver and Ruth Lake, I presume.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so tell us about these characters. Other than that initial scene that you had in your head, who is Greg Carver and his partner Ruth Lake? How did you start developing them, and when did you know how complicated their relationship was going to be?
Well, I'm a plotter, and I do outline novels in detail. When Helen and I finished talking about this particular scenario, I went away and I wrote probably about 40,000 word outline. So that took a while, but, you know, with kind of input from Helen right the way along, so that I wasn't going down too many blind alleys. So how did they develop? Well, I had that question in my mind from the start, you know, who are these people? And it seemed to me to be a great idea to have really the main investigator shot right at the start of the novel. So Greg Carver is the guy who's shot. And it's as he starts to recover that we discover that he's holding back. Now, anyone who has had a traumatic head injury or even really kind of blood loss, which results in the brain being starved of oxygen, can have, you know, amnesia and can have problems with concentration and all the rest of it. But we know as the readers that he's holding back. But we also know that Ruth is holding back. And she's the one who actually faked whatever she was doing at the scene. She faked the scene. So two people are lying, and they're the two people who are the central investigators in this serial killer investigation. And actually, I didn't know why they were lying initially. And it was actually in the kind of drafting process and in the outlining process that came out. And I think characters, I don't know whether you feel this way yourself, Hank, that characters develop in ways that you don't expect them to. And you just have to go with it sometimes.
Absolutely. And to touch back to what we were saying earlier about Stephen King, he is a very staunch non-outliner, and he believes that you just discover the story as you go. You said you were a very detailed outliner, but you were discovering your characters through the outlining process. Do you allow room in your outline for characters to do new things that maybe you haven't thought of? When you do a detailed outline like you do, how do you keep the story fresh and your characters unpredictable?
Well, the outline, it sounds terribly clinical, and I think people misunderstand what I mean by outlining. But, part of the outline might be a scene that suddenly comes to me out of nowhere, or an action that someone does that I don't understand, but it will become clear to me later on. So there can be these very kind of disconnected, disparate, really confusing things going on. And I kind of have to get those down on paper. And even after the outline, when I'm sitting down to do the actual writing, things will change. And I can't really understand what this person's doing here and why they've done this. And finally it becomes clear to me. Or else one person starts behaving in a way that I hadn't predicted as I'm doing the kind of the more, well, I think it's all creative, but the more kind of free-flowing writing. And I allow them that freedom to develop in the way that they need to develop. And that often enriches the story, I find.
Right. There's no judgment on my part on whether you outline or not. I think every writer's different. We all come to the creative process differently. And the only thing I avoid 100% is when people say this is the way you have to do it. You stay away from those people, because if you try to take on someone else's writing form, point by point, you're going to be miserable. But with a book with as many twists and turns and gotcha moments as this book has, I would think that you would have to have an outline of sorts, at least to keep up with the the plot turns, and or you as a writer would be completely lost.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and sometimes I am anyway. But you've just got to keep going with it. Actually, on that subject of plotting and outlining, I went to see Jeffrey Deaver about a week or so ago. He was on at Chester, which is a town near me, and he said that he'd had this discussion with Lee Child, because Jeffrey Deaver outlines, but I think he said 8 or 9 months a year, and then sits down and writes the novel. And Lee Child just writes the novel. And he said,
right,
if he'd just take my advice, he'd do okay. This Lee Child. It is, you've just got to work with what works for you. And I think it varies even from novel to novel sometimes.
Yeah.
Can I just butt in there?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's quite interesting hearing Margaret talking to Anne Cleves, because they've known each other for a long time, and they're quite good buddies. And Margaret's an outliner and a plotter, and Anne really, really isn't. You'll say to her, "Oh, how's the story going?" "Oh, well, I'm a bit stuck. I'm 65,000 words in and I don't know who the killer is yet, so I think I might just go for a walk." And Margaret's face will just be a picture at that. It's just so much fun listening to them talk to each other about their own process and their own way of doing things.
Margaret, I'll bet in your mind you're thinking, "Oh my God, you've just wasted 65,000 words because you don't know what you're doing."
Well, there is that kind of fear. I think that might be part of it with me. When I first started writing, I never used to outline. And I had such a horrible time doing rewrites that I thought, I've just got to find a better way of doing this. And the outlining seems to have worked for me, so I'm sticking with it.
whatever works for you. I love it. So when you guys started working the story out, what was your collaboration process like? So you guys met and you wanted to work together. Margaret, you had this kernel of an idea and you started pitching things back and forth to Helen, and she was pitching ideas back to you. How did that start to formalize, and what was your writing process like between the two of you?
Well, it's hard to remember this one because it was so long ago, but I can tell you that the things that we've worked on since then, we do a lot of work literally either over the phone or by email. So I will kind of send, Helen, I've got this idea, would this work? Or, for example, the tattoos, that's a really good example. I'd said to her, so if we've only got sort of a very decayed body, can we tell if it has been tattooed? And Helen explained to me that, you can get inks from tattoos in the lymph glands, and you can actually tell the different colors of ink that have been used in those tattoos. So you can actually match them eventually to, if someone says, oh yes, they had a red, yellow and green tattoo on their arm, you can actually find those red, yellow and green inks quite possibly in the lymph glands. I've probably got that completely wrong, Helen, have I?
Yeah, that's more if the limb's been amputated, because the lymph glands are sort of near the joints. They'll still be there on the torso. So if you've got a body, you can look at the lymph glands and find out if the limbs had tattoos on them and what colours they were and things. Just by looking at the lymph glands.
Oh, that's crazy. That makes me scared to death to get a tattoo.
Well, do you know what? I've always been quite conflicted about tattoos. And I do think some of them are so very beautiful. But on the other hand, people do go to some extremes. And I think probably this idea about tattoos has been bubbling along in my mind since, way back. But I did go to see, in 2010, I went to see an exhibition at the Wellcome Foundation in London. It was, I'd just been to a Crime Writers Association meeting, and I had a couple of hours before I got the train home. And there was an exhibition there of human skin that had been tattooed. And these pieces of skin had been collected by a very strange person in the 1800s and had been kept by the Wellcome Trust. And they did this exhibition on skin. So I was fascinated by that. And I think just that idea, and the fact that I found it disturbing, I think, is useful in that it means that it probably will be disturbing to other people. But that's what eventually came out 6 years on from there, in the novel, in Splinter In The Blood. So you just never know where the inspiration is coming from.
That's one of the major differences between Margaret and I. She's got 2 hours to spare. Oh, I'll go and look at an exhibition of hunks of dead skin. I'm more sort of, I'll go and get some tea and a nice piece of cake.
Well, I think what makes a writer is when you happen onto something and you say, "Oh my goodness, that is very disturbing," and then you realize you've taken out a notebook and you're writing down all the ways you can disturb other people with it.
That's so true. That really is true.
So did you two work on the outline together as you're forming ideas as the outlining process went about?
Sorry, you go first, Margaret.
I think we sort of interleaved, didn't we? So I would do a section and then say, look, what do you think of this? And can you tell me some interesting things that people wouldn't expect in this particular scenario? Do you remember how that's how it worked?
Yeah, and I'd butt in and say, oh, but you could do this here, or you could do that, or whatever, and you'd either go, oh, yes, or no. So, it was very much sort of backwards and forwards, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And there was an occasion where we're just about, I'm finishing the edits on the second novel in the series. And when we were outlining that one, we were sitting in a pub somewhere in the northeast, which was empty when we actually went into the bar and talking about different scenarios. And by the end of the morning, I just said something like, yeah, but what are we going to do about all these body parts? And then we realized that the room was full of business people. And they'd all stopped and looked at us. So you can get quite involved and kind of, the world just passes you by.
Oh my goodness, that's hilarious. Where does the book take place?
Okay, so the book is set in Liverpool, which is actually the city of my birth, city of the Beatles, on the northwest coast of England. And it's a city that's changed an awful lot since 2008, when it was made capital of culture for that year, the European capital of culture. And over those intervening years, it's actually a lot of money has come into the place, a lot of development has gone on, but there are still elements of extreme poverty and weirdness that you can tap into, which makes it a brilliant combination, really, in terms of writing crime fiction.
Well, I know that, Margaret, you said you're from Liverpool, and Helen, you said you're from Yorkshire. I definitely had that northern England kind of feel to this book. It's very much a character of the book, if you will. A lot of us from the States, when we think of England, one of the first things we think of is London and kind of all the touristy things that we've seen throughout our lives. And that just kind of becomes the lens that you look through. But I love what you've done with this book and how the setting and the way the setting affects the characters and how that kind of otherness of what we typically think of England comes through in the book. Was that a very conscious effort on your part?
Well, strangely enough, I have written a couple of my earlier novels set in Liverpool, and I think probably I toned down to an extent that kind of Liverpool element, even though I think place is really, really important. And I think it is a city that has a kind of a European confidence now, but it still has the elements of, well, you know, a lot of Irish immigrants came through Liverpool in order to go on to America during the potato famine. It's still a very busy port, although it has kind of, in terms of transporting things to and from, it's a lot quieter than it used to be. So yes, I think the element of place and belonging, I think, as much as anything, because Ruth, as one of the central characters, is born and brought up in Liverpool, whereas Carver is actually an import from London. So he worked for London Met and he's come to Liverpool. So you have the kind of the person who really belongs and is part of Liverpool, and the person who sees it as an outsider. I just wanted to kind of play with that a little bit. But there's also, I think, the fact that the city is visually so strong and so rather beautiful, actually, if you go to the riverfront, is a strong element in the story. And those kind of aspects I mentioned before about the extremes of poverty and richness and wealth and kind of, you know, the drugs problems that every city has these days, all of those kind of combine together to make something, I hope, which is recognizable beyond British shores. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you had been working on the second book in the series, so these characters live on to solve crime yet again? Oh, yes. We couldn't let them go, could we, Helen?
No, not at all. We were having far too much fun with them. And if this book makes you lose sleep, you're going to have the light on for about a fortnight after the next book.
Oh man. Well, you guys will have to come back and talk about it when that book comes out, because I'm sure I'll have things psychologically that I'll need to work out, and I'll need to talk with you guys about it and see if I can get my sleep back. The Splinter in the Blood is the new book. It's out now. I don't think that we talked about the nature of the killer and the serial killer in this book. What is the thing that they're trying to solve?
Right. The victims have all been murdered in the same way, in a very sadistic way, actually, by having tattoos hand tapped with a single thorn into their flesh. And the killer has used a dye, which he's then incorporated into with some a kind of paralytic, I suppose, which accumulates in the skin of the victims and finally suffocates them, kills them. But they're elaborately tattooed. The only part of the body that isn't tattooed is the face. So it's all of the body, the hands, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, everywhere is tattooed with Celtic symbols, with strange sort of slightly animalistic tattoos, and also, very importantly, by these strange eyes. Some are open, some are closed. And that element of it is important to the killer. And this sort of thorn tapping is an ancient kind of ritual, and I think it's only used by one or two tribes now. It's very painful. The thorn that's used is pyracantha, which is it's a vicious thorn. It's really, really hard and strong. And if you get a pyracantha thorn under your skin, you feel it for weeks afterwards until it works its way out. So it might be because I'm a gardener that I actually decided on pyracantha. I'm not sure. But interestingly enough, the pyracantha thorn has been used. There was a discovery of a hoard of gold and silver buried in the ground in the Midlands of England, which was discovered in 2009. And something like, I think it was about nearly 5 kilos of beautifully worked gold work, thousands and thousands of garnets, something like, I think it was about 2 kilos of silverware. And it was filthy. It was covered in mud and, build up since about the 6th or 7th century. And they actually cleaned very meticulously. They cleaned this hoard using pyracantha thorns because it was hard enough, but not so hard it would scratch the gold. So it's just got a history that really resonates with me.
Wow, and makes a great pun for the title in Splinter in the Blood. That's great. Margaret and Helen, you guys write under the name Ashley Dyer. Where did Ashley come from?
It was a committee decision, actually. We knew that we wanted to write under a different name, and that's because, well, it was the first time I was writing with Helen in collaboration. So a new name seemed appropriate, but our publisher didn't want initials, and they wanted something that was fairly androgynous. So we actually discussed with the agent, we discussed with the publisher, we put different ideas forward, and that was the one that everyone agreed on. So Ashley and Dyer together were the two names that everyone thought, yeah, that works. So who are we to argue?
Right. Well, the new book is called Splinter in the Blood. I highly recommend this book if you are a fan of thrillers and psychological thrillers and police procedurals like I am. I know you're going to love this book, and it's out just in time for your beach vacations. And you can read this lying on the beach, and no one will judge you for the horrendous thoughts that you're having because everybody else will be reading it as well. Where can people find you online and connect with you and follow along with what you guys are doing?
Oh, thanks for asking that. We are online as ashley-dyer.com, But we also have a Facebook page, and Helen writes kind of forensic microblogs, and I write microblogs on writing. Very short, very pithy. If people want to follow us there, we are Ashley Dyer Novels on Facebook. So you can find us in either of those places. We are also at Ashley Dyer 2017 on Twitter. So there's lots of ways to connect with us. And we do like people asking questions, so please don't feel shy.
Excellent. Well, I will put links to all of those places in the show notes, and expect people to come asking questions and following along. Helen and Margaret, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The brutes of the Andersonville Prison Hospital have moved me to the dead room, or so it has come to be known. None so domiciled have yet left this place. We receive only the smallest rations and only cursory care, to reduce our odors and spare the nostrils of our keepers. The good Christians of the Confederacy do not see any need to provide comfort to those who will soon sleep soundly enough underground. You must know, at least, how your father came to such an end. At Doctortown, Kilpatrick entrusted me with the conquest of a railroad trestle, and my bummers, my demolition team, acquitted themselves admirably, thanks to my ingenuity with powder. We successfully destroyed the trestle work past Morgan's Lake. This would prove to be my entire contribution to the war. Federal troops were unable to capture the bridge or overcome the enemy's battery. Kilpatrick withdrew, and my bummers and I found ourselves on the wrong side of the Altamaha River, behind the enemy line with no hope of reaching our encampment. Rebels accosted us, taking our remaining supplies. We escaped and headed south, hoping by a long march to reach Seymour's forces in Jacksonville, but we encountered other rebel encampments at Jessup. 4 of my men were lost to gunfire. We marched west, then south again, barely evading capture. We had no choice but to brave the great swamp Okefenokee. Oh, on and on it goes, in every direction, endlessly. We trudged through miles of grasping mud and noxious rot, pursued by hunger and the mosquito, scratching at our arms and faces until all our skin was scourged. We lived off alligator meat at first, then nothing at all. My men grew mutinous, blamed me for all their misfortunes, threatened to throw me in a sack, weigh me down with stones, and sink my body. Yet was I not equally hungry? Did I not starve? I grew weary of their endless insubordination and contempt. Finally, they took hold of me and swore they would hang me by the neck for leading them to ruin. They were 5 in number, younger than I and more muscular. I was no match for them physically. They laid their hands on me, and I burned them. I burned those men. The flame rose from me as from a volcano, stripping the skin from those boys, blackening their faces, roasting their flesh. And let this be my final ghastly confession. I feasted that night, feasted on the meat of my prospective murderers. And that is how I survived. I staggered alone from that swamp, a mad thing, fueled by outrage and guilt. I saw an encampment of rebel soldiers and surrendered myself gladly. They say in Andersonville prison all men are brothers, equal in filth, equal in terror, equal in ruin. Yet I feel I may claim some small distinction, at least. For I am surely damned to a greater extent than any here.